everyone. Welcome to the session. Just a reminder, after the session is over, we do need to clear the room completely so that we can get ready for whatever may be following this session in here. Today, I'd like to introduce Derek Vidala, the Chief Risk Officer of BitSight. He'll be leading a panel on preparing for the new era of cybersecurity disclosure.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us. We expect to have a very rigorous discussion today on some of the emerging changes to cybersecurity disclosure, especially as we think about things like the upcoming SEC rules and just generally the landscape around this as it's evolved over the last decade or so, and how we're all thinking about this as the industry moves forward. I wanted to just take a minute to introduce all of our panelists. First, Jamil Farshki, who is the EVP and Chief Information Security Officer at Equifax. Leslie Ritter, who is a Vice President and Credit Analyst in the Moody's Cyber Risk Group at Moody's Corporation and Moody's Investor Service. And Scott Giordano, who's the Head of Privacy and the General Counsel for Sperian. So just thanks very much to all of our panelists today. And I wanted to really start with kind of a framing question, which is that we're seeing a lot of companies do more on cyber risk disclosure. This is something that's been evolving, I think, since the original SEC guidance was put in place a few years ago, I think about 5 years now. And we're seeing metrics emerge. We're seeing those metrics make their way into things like 10Ks and other annual reporting, whether it's ESG or sustainability reporting. And I wanted to get a sense of why are we seeing this happening more and more? And Scott, thought we could start with you and for sort of a view on what are we seeing, why are we seeing it, and how do you think about it's evolving?
We're seeing a lot more disclosures by publicly traded companies about events that have happened, incidents and so forth, and I think we've seen that because of what happened in 2017. What's interesting is if you think about the attacks on the Ukraine that happened in 2017, that was, for me, a game changer because you saw there that a lot of companies that were not the target of the attack, okay? So back then, this was the NotPetya attack that happened in 2017, presumably by the Russian GRU. It targeted Ukraine, but the side effects, the collateral damage, was worldwide. It was about $10 billion worth of damage. And it hit so many companies in so many different capacities, and it just changed this dynamic that we're not a target, we're not important, no one cares about us, no one's going to attack us. That was all gone at that point. And I think from that point forward, companies started realizing that we have to be able to disclose what's happening in terms of any kind of cyber incidents or cyber attacks or even suspected ones to be able to demonstrate that they're doing their due diligence, they're doing their jobs, they're disclosing the kind of things that investors would want to know. And that's what's led us here today.
Can I say something? I think that was a factor. I think the plague of ransomware and the effects therein is actually what drove companies to start, or what drove the precedent for disclosure. When we see company after company after company, I was just telling someone a minute ago, there was like four or five peers called me in the last week because they were dealing with the same thing. And your shareholders see that, hey, wait a minute, my investment, this company can no longer do business, right, until it gets resolved. And then you have the effect of double ransomware coming in where if you don't pay, they're going to start releasing all this information and make you even have a worse black eye. I think it was the culmination and the realization that, look, cyber is serious. I think Ukraine compounded it. I think it had an effect to help drive the amplification therein. But I think the ransomware play we've been dealing with for the last few years is what's really struck folks and put us where we are today.
Do you think that's being driven reactively to those events for the companies that affect them, or do you see a wider field of people that are being more proactive about this as they're thinking about, is it a competitive differentiator to be more transparent? Are people thinking about it differently than perhaps just a reactive way to make sure they're following the rules or the guidance correctly?
On the whole, it's reactive, but there's no question that there are a handful of organizations who are leading from the front and are taking a proactive stance on this. I'm not going to, toot my own horn at Equifax, but like we did it. We, in the wake of our 2018 breach, we have, for the last 3 years in a row now, have released a security annual report, which includes a whole bevy of metrics and data points around the internals of our program, some of which even make me uncomfortable sometimes, to release, because we want to be transparent. There was another, HP just released their own this year, same thing. And there's several other organizations that I know of that are in the process of doing that. So I think there are some great examples of organizations who are being proactive, but I think on the whole, it's mostly reactive and it's duck and cover.
And Derek, maybe if I can add here also, there's obviously the proactive or reactive disclosure, but there's also demand from external constituents. Here I represent the capital markets. We're very aware, we read the news, we hear about these ransomware attacks, these data breaches, and these massive financial impacts that some of these events have. That has a direct impact on cost of capital. And we need to price this into our cost of capital. So when we think of lending money or investing, we talk to companies about what they're doing on cyber, and we've seen a big evolution in terms of the amount of disclosures that we're getting on that end.
Yeah.
When you're thinking about that from a credit standpoint, as someone that's looking at this and thinking about how to analyze it from that standpoint, how do you think about the range of disclosures that are going on? How does that, are there things that are helpful there? Are there things that are lacking? How do you think about the universe of what's available to you?
Currently, it's still on the whole lacking. I mean, if you read Ks, which are the financial disclosures, the annual reports that most public companies put out, they'll mention that cyber is very a significant risk, and then they'll talk about their mitigants is basically cyber insurance. Maybe they carry cyber insurance, that's all they'll tell you. As somebody who has to consider all risk factors when pricing capital, that doesn't give me much comfort. We're in a position where we can have very in-depth conversations with CISOs of different firms and really kind of get a better sense of the robustness of the practice that's actually being practiced in those, the issuers that we look at. But on the whole, it's still lagging.
Do you think more disclosure will create an improvement in some of the underlying issues? How are all of you thinking about that? If we're headed toward this new era, does that create a rising tide effect for participants in the market?
I think it does, depending on the integrity of the disclosure. I've read some disclosures that are a disaster. They don't tell you anything useful, and if there's nothing useful in there, then there's nothing useful for capital markets. So you really have to look at the nature and the integrity of the disclosure and say, is there anything meaningful here? Do investors care about what they're talking about, or is this something that is just theater and it was just done to check a box, not really because the organization cared about the integrity of its own systems?
I think it's a good step, though. I think you're right. The integrity of the disclosure matters. But I think the fact that it's a component of a disclosure in and of itself is a good step, because it means someone has thought about it. It means that the executive team has taken a look at it. I go through them every single quarter before we file, and I have to read through it and make sure that all the risks, everything, all the language and stuff is right. It means the board has looked at it. And so even if you aren't being, if it's not done in good faith, the fact that you've gone through that process means that at least there's some visibility on it. Whereas in the past, look, I'll tell you, from earlier in my career, I could have never expected, when I started off in security, I would have never expected we would have arrived here so quickly, even though it has been 20 years. But we're here now, and to think about cyber being a prominent issue for investors and for boards of directors and for bankers, I think it's all sort of culminating, and it's all pushing us down this path where security is going to be quite meaningful to all organizations. It's going to be, without a doubt, a board level topic, and as a result of that, it just shines the light, a spotlight in this space. And I think, just like, Justice Brandeis used to say, or has said, it's, and I blank on the term, if shine a light, what is the
Sunlight is
the best disinfectant.
Yeah.
Sounds a sweet one by me. But so sunlight is the best disinfectant. And I think that that's going to help all of the folks like me be able to help protect our organizations more effectively, because we will get the prioritization and the attention we need and we just have not had to date.
Mm-hmm. And I think also in terms of the rising tide, it does force the companies that aren't doing anything to become more rigorous and be accountable on something that they really haven't had to be so accountable on prior.
You've written, Leslie, about, or the rating agency has written about this concept, and where you see certain standards or regulations create that effect, and you've, I think, put research out that shows that as credit positive. Can you say a little bit about where you're seeing that in the market and maybe some of the effects that you've seen among different sectors, or where do you see that happening already, even without disclosure?
I mean, the poster child, I guess, is really the banking sector, which has a lot more disclosure and more regulation as well tied to it, and where we do even now see, if you look again at those cases and you look at the disclosure around cyber and what they're, not only the risks that they're facing, but how they're mitigating the risk, it's much more substantial than if you look at other types of sectors. And when we did a study where we looked at across the board, across all the banks that we looked at, so the massive, large bulge bracket firms as well as the regional banks, and there was a fair amount of consistency in the amount of disclosure, regardless of the size. Now, if we do the same study in other industries, electric utilities, for instance, we see a huge amount of disparity. The largest of the largest look to banks and they look to other sectors and kind of try to mimic a little bit what those other industries do, but the smaller players are lagging.
So we know that these proposed SEC rules are likely to be formalized soon. I don't think we have an indication of when that is. I think we were wondering if we'd be talking about them in the past tense or not today. And they're coming. Some of the sort of predecessor rules were released about a month ago for registered investment advisors and broker dealers and some other parts of the industry. How should people be preparing for that change? What should be the focus of CISOs who perhaps haven't had to deal with this to date and will have to deal with it when this is formalized?
When one of the most important changes that we've seen in the new SEC rules, which I suspect will be formalized by the end of the month, is that you have as an organization to disclose policies and procedures that you have to anticipate and mitigate cyber risk. That's huge because they also ask you to do it in the context of what management's role is, and more importantly, to your points earlier, what the board's role is. So this is a game changer in and of itself because now you're looking inside a company and saying, okay, what kind of policies and procedures do we have to be able to mitigate these attacks, to be able to defend against them? What is management doing? What is the board doing? And by the way, does anyone on the board have cybersecurity experience? That was a very interesting little thing they just added into there, and I think it was not an afterthought. I think they did that and they kind of snuck it in there, but I like it because it's the idea that we're going to create some incentive for boards to have folks with cybersecurity experience, and I think that's huge. So taking that collectively, it's a big change from the 2018 rules.
How Jamil, maybe, how do you think about the risks around disclosure? Because there's obviously just been a bit of a tug of war among the security community about what's appropriate to disclose, what's perhaps giving attackers an advantage, what perhaps is giving your competitors an advantage if you're saying something that they're not. As a CISO, how are you thinking about this and how are you preparing?
Look, I don't see anything in the requirement, in the proposals, that would suggest we're going to put ourselves at any kind of risk whatsoever. Now I should caveat that with I cannot stand security by obscurity to begin with, and so I do not advocate for that. So if you are, then maybe you're in a different camp. That said, we've been crazy transparent, and I haven't seen some major uptick in terms of the volume of attacks or the sophistication of them. Russia hasn't turned its cannon over, to us, and I don't expect them to. Especially when we talk about some of the stuff that is being required here. The board looking at policies and procedures, making sure you've got an effective program, having a viewpoint on cyber risk. And again, this is an area, this is something that can happen to any company. And I can't think in this modern era and how reliant we all are on technology, I can't think of a single company that wouldn't be hit hard and have significant downside impacts if they were to be hit by, ransomware, for example. It just grinds everything to a halt. So when I look at the severity and the likelihood of potential risk on this front, look, it's got to be pretty darn high. I would argue it. I can't think of another risk that has the same likelihood and impact that organizations are facing generally speaking, on a regular basis. So I don't think that it injects any meaningful risk for organizations to go through these things. And I think that what it ends up doing is helping them be better prepared, do the right thing, follow those best practices, which in turn then helps cascade throughout the broader ecosystem and helps us all be more secure, both at an organizational professional level as well as in a personal one.
I think in a way it almost removes speculation from the external stakeholders, right? They'll see, okay, he has things under control. He's already told us they have a framework. This is how they're implementing it. We don't need to know the ins and outs. We will never understand the ins and outs. That doesn't matter, right? But we don't need to speculate about do they know what they're doing? Do they have any expertise? And that's already a big thing to address.
We're not given our network architectures or here's my source code for app A or B. It doesn't inject any meaningful risk.
Scott, can you take us through a bit about what's changing or what's expected to change from 2018 to
Sure.
what you
Sure.
think might be here in a month?
And by the way, when we say 2018, there's a set of rules the SEC promulgated for publicly traded companies in 2018 about disclosure. And it was a very basic document. And that's not to say it was bad. It was only about 20 pages of material, which from a lawyer standpoint is like a paragraph. It talked about just doing all the basics that we would all expect for cybersecurity and notification. And in fact, it mandates that organizations have to notify promptly the SEC whenever there is a compromise or potential compromise. What changed, though, actually three things. One is that there's now a 4-day limit to notifying the SEC. And that in and of itself is not a big deal because many of you are probably subject to a 72-hour rule. I know I've been in the past. The difference is that this 4-day rule is mandatory even if the FBI, for example, said, don't disclose that, we're still doing an investigation, we don't want to tip our hand. By the SEC's standpoint, you have to disclose anyway. That's very interesting. I'd like to see if that's actually going to make it into the final rule because it's created a lot of unhappiness amongst my colleagues, not surprisingly. Secondly, I mentioned earlier about the role of the board and management has to be very clearly articulated. And then finally, this idea of having cybersecurity expertise on your board, I think that is going to really help us collectively because it's going to elevate cybersecurity to something that's on par with everything else that's important that investors should know.
Thanks, Scott. I want to come back to the board and education in a bit, but I want to go to a word that appears in the proposed rules that I think is causing some considerations or maybe even some concerns, and that word is materiality. And my sense from talking to colleagues and others is this is one of the words, one of the parts of this proposed rule that is going to cause the most ambiguity. And I'm wondering if you could say something about how you're thinking about materiality, which is, according to the way the rules are written right now, not just about the financial amount that a potential incident might cause. So how should people be thinking about the M word?
I like the M word because the rule is essentially what would your typical investor want to know? That's the touchstone. That's what's material. And you ask yourself, okay, I'm an average investor. What would I want to know? And when you start reading the kind of disclosures that we are seeing and we expect to see, when you're seeing things that are consistent with your understanding of best practices, that then creates this culture of disclosure where materiality are things that you and I and all the rest of the professionals here would expect to see. So I think that's the touchstone. Now, is that going to be debated? Of course it is, but I think overall it's a good standard to have.
I totally agree. It's the best out of what's available right now. I mean, if you look at it today, you've got some legislation around 24-hour reporting, 48-hour reporting, 72-hour reporting. You know, this one at least is like, okay, materiality, that means something. So it's going to run, because when I look at 20, whatever the time frame is, my immediate concern is, well, wait a minute, like we don't know much when it first happens. So it takes a while to go through the analysis and actually figure out if something is impactful. And do I really want to alert everybody and freak everybody out if it turns out to be nothing at all? And so the materiality thing is great because it gives you the flexibility to be able to make a meaningful judgment decision in a space that isn't as black and white and as concrete as everyone I think wants it to be. It's just not. And so I'm a huge proponent. When I saw this, initially, whatever it was, last year or before, I think it's a boon for us, and I think we're infinitely able to follow that because we can apply our own judgment.
As a CISO, when you think about materiality, are you thinking about that as a framework that you're working through internally? Can you say something about how others might think about a framework to use around this?
Well, the first one is you just go straight to the financials, right? Mm-hmm. If it's around 5% of your revenue, then you're generally going to say, it exceeds 5% of your revenue, they're generally going to say, okay, like that's material. But I think beyond that, you have to look at, it depends on the type of business you're in, but like, look, how many customer records potentially, consumer mm-hmm. records potentially have been compromised? What's the likelihood that this particular outage is going to affect my long-term operations, or what's the loss of this source code going to do to my competitive positioning? So you have to go through a whole gamut of things, I think, to be able to, and it depends on the industry in terms of how you would sort of frame that out.
Leslie, you think about materiality all the time in the context of the work that you and your colleagues do. When you're thinking about this across a wide field of market participants, how are you thinking about cyber materiality as this emerges?
It's the financial impact, right? And what kind of potential loss could you face, right? So there's this emerging approach of this cyber risk quantification, which should allow us to unlock a lot of this understanding and allow us to do better financial modeling and better sensitivity analysis about whether or not a given attack tips the scale or not from a credit standpoint, at least.
And do you think about it differently for different sectors, or is it just, as Jamil said, is it just sort of a flat 5% potentially? I don't know that that's the right number, but how do you think about it from a sector
We're a bit
standpoint?
more forgiving. It's more 10% of EBITDA.
Oh,
so
I like that. I like that.
But,
10 is my new number.
On average, we look at leverage. For what I do, which is really credit ratings, we look at leverage ratios and anything that, and we have preset transparent thresholds, and if you tip those thresholds, you fall into a different rating category, because those leverage ratios correlate. We have 100 years worth of data that correlate more closely to a certain outcome of probability of default and loss given defaults. So that's all data driven.
When you're thinking about the future of disclosure, you could be seeing a lot more data made available to you as part of your analytical process. How do you think about looking at that data as a whole, and how do you think about it sort of making its way into these types of analyses? Is that something you're thinking about mm-hmm. as a credit analyst, and sort of where do you think you take that?
No, absolutely. I think it's still very much a work in process, because we're learning as we go along, but I think we're kind of putting stakes in the ground. There's this concept of just cyber governance, and a lot of what we were talking at the beginning of disclosures, and what kind of infrastructure do you have in place to handle an event. And then there's the concept of cyber loss quantification, right? Because then you can really run financial numbers and see how it hits your leverage ratios, and whether that's going to be sustainable or if it's going to come back. And then there's other concepts of mitigation, like cyber insurance, for instance, and how that would help offset some of the financial impact that you have. That's how we're looking at it at this point in time, but I'm sure it's going to evolve a lot over time.
Is there a supply chain component to this? If you're a company that relies on critical suppliers, and they have an incident that becomes material, how are all of you thinking about considering that, either in direct disclosure or maybe even as part of the way that you have to monitor that supply chain ecosystem? Is this something people should be thinking about?
I mean, I would think about it. But it depends on how it directly affects your organization. So it's certainly a component of it. No different than, hey, if you have a bunch of data that gets compromised by a supplier through some mechanism that you're providing it to them, then you've got to take that into account as well.
We talked about materiality. We also talked a little earlier about some of the requirements for boards to become more educated. And I've heard from some directors that there's some anxiety to this, that maybe it's a bit of an emerging pain point. How do you see boards handling that aspect of the potential regulation? Is this something they are working with the CISO on exclusively? Is it something they need to be out there in the market educating themselves? How do you think directors should be focused on that particular aspect?
I think you will find that the directors will develop subcommittees just for cybersecurity and hopefully for privacy, but at a minimum for cybersecurity. They will take the opportunity to either find third parties to brief them, educate them on what they need to know, and more importantly, on what the implications are for not doing a certain course of action. I think that one of the challenges that I'll speak for my fellow general counsel, is getting attention from boards about doing things that are going to be the ounce of prevention that prevents the pound of cure, and to be able to sell that to them when there may not be anything apparent that is really necessary to fix, but yet the kind of things that we need to do to prevent bigger things from happening down the road, sometimes it's just a very hard sell. With that kind of education, I think that they would be able to be a lot more receptive to those kind of arguments.
And the encouraging thing is that there's a lot of motivation amongst directors nowadays to learn about cyber. They recognize that, look, this is a hot topic. This is something they should know about. I did a talk at NACD. They also have some great resources around training directors on cyber as well. I did a talk at their annual thing last year, and it was a packed house. And I thought it was going to be like 7 people. Because it was on cyber, and they were deeply engaged, and they asked some super thoughtful questions. And there's not a director I speak to today that doesn't, query me around all kinds of random cyber topics, because they want to know, and they know they need to know.
Yeah, I think it needs to be made accessible. It's almost the same as for the financial markets. You can't speak cyber to them. You have to speak what regular people speak. Find the right vernacular. Frame it properly. Don't go into the weeds of tech, and that's attainable. I mean, I think that's really what's changed. On the board comment too, I think we've surveyed over 1,000 companies to inquire about where cyber sits on their boards, and we're seeing a shift. Historically, it's been very much in the risk committee, but the risk committee already has a massive mandate, and it's largely financial folks. But some of the more maybe mature companies have created digital committees, is what they typically call it, where they house cybersecurity, and typically most of the directors that head up those committees are cyber professionals, so I think that helps a lot too.
Is that where you see this living in the future, a tech or a digital committee, or as opposed to a risk committee?
Yeah, it makes so much more sense.
How do you think, is there a lesson to be learned from, and I think there's a little bit of a positive and negative here, but there have been discussions about, is ESG a framework for sort of how to think about, how should boards continue to think about this? Because that was something that 10 years ago, 15 years ago, everybody was scrambling to kind of think about ESG, especially the E and the sustainability and the climate part. Can we learn something from that? I know you look at that, Leslie, from a credit perspective as well. What can we learn from that process? And Jamil, are you seeing
I'm happy
things?
to comment on this one.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
From our perspective, we were very reactive to ESG, candidly. We're being much more proactive in terms of cyber, because I think there was a realization that digitization is happening across all the sectors that we look at. It goes from the smallest school districts that we rate to the largest Fortune 500 companies that we rate. So cyber is ubiquitous as a result, because digitization introduces new vulnerabilities, and that means that cyber is something that we have to consider. I think we're a few years behind ESG, but we're heading in that direction. And the more we speak with investors, and they ask us a lot about cyber, but they're all looking for basically what we call issuers company level indicators of risk. They want to be able to differentiate between Pepsi and Coca-Cola, but right now, given the disclosures that are out there, they can't. But they're asking for it, and eventually they're going to get their way.
You guys can help with that. On the ESG thing for me, I think ESG in general is great. And what I love is that for cyber, depending on what, if it's MSCI or Sustainalytics or whatever, 25 to 33% of it, it applies to cyber and privacy, cybersecurity and privacy, which is great. The problem though is this: the measures that are being used and the assessment therein is as weak as one could ever imagine. Like you see this stuff and you're like, well, how did you arrive at this? And so I think there needs to be a ton of more attention and scrutiny on that. And if that happens, then I think the incorporation of it into ESG and the reliance on the results of the ESG scores would be fantastic. But right now we're not there.
So you think of it as cyber and ESG, not cyber as just a piece of the
No, I think of cyber as a piece of ESG. The problem is today, the way that they're measuring the cyber and privacy components of ESG leaves a lot to be desired.
It's largely a blanket score, regardless of based on your industry. I mean, let's be
I'll
honest.
send a random 3-question questionnaire and you're like, okay, here's my answer.
Yeah.
It's not good.
I know we want to make sure we have some time for audience questions, so maybe I will just open it up and then we can double back on some stuff we have here if there aren't a ton of questions. I don't know if we have microphones or
We're here.
or just people standing up works too. Yeah.
Question for you. You guys kind of mixed two things. You're talking about disclosures. Sorry, Sean Bowen, CISO World Fuel Services. You talked about disclosure, but you also talked a little bit about annual reports earlier. Do you see us getting to a point where we have a structured with prescriptive rules, kind of like the 10K has, a form you have to fill out with different things, that has a cyber 10K-ish structure so that your annual report that you mentioned, which I download, HP's annual report, they're not the same. So as a shareholder, I have to relearn each of my company's components. So do we get to a standardized annual report or quarterly report from a cybersecurity risk piece that is both? It's got to obviously got to pair up with a company that has IT as support of delivering their business versus a company that delivers IT as their business, which I do both. So I have to fill out both these reports. But how do you see this coming, and do you think that that's in our near future? If not, anything you guys can do to make it happen faster?
Near future?
Yes.
No.
Yeah.
I don't see that. I think it's a fantastic idea. And I don't know, for those of you who saw the first annual release that we did of our security annual report, I even said that. I was like, hey, we're doing this. I would love for others to opine on this because I don't even, we're just forging the path here. I don't know what's good and what's not good in terms of, and what would work across the industry. But I think if we had that, it would solve the problem you were just talking about too, because you would be able to legitimately do an apples to apples comparison between organizations and by virtue of that, all kinds of other stuff. I don't see it coming anytime soon, but I think that the direction we're heading leads us down the path of potentially being able to someday achieve that.
I'd add, we just did a look back of the last couple of years of various regulatory filings and other, investor relations reports, and we saw about 100 companies that were citing some kind of cyber metric, whether it was a cyber rating or just other information about a cybersecurity program. And 3+ years ago, that number was near zero, with some exceptions, including what Equifax has done. And so whether that becomes a standard way to do it, I think will remain to be seen as the regulations emerge. But certainly there's more reporting through various channels that are available. I think we had.
Yep, quick question.
yeah.
Excellent discussion. Thank you guys very much. 2 very quick questions. First one was for Leslie. You had mentioned that you speak with companies to determine essentially their security program, and that has an impact on their valuation. Are you using quantification, like risk quantification methodology, for example, FAIR, or is that too high level, or do you have some other kind of quantification, or is it just
At this point, it's very qualitative. We have some quantification. We're taking some technical data from BitSight. We're also having some technical data that we have from self-reported information through surveys that we do.
I see.
But we're heading in the direction of cyber risk quantification.
Okay.
That's-
Is there a specific way that you're going to be quantifying that, or is that still to be determined?
It'll be with a lot of help from BitSight.
Oh, I see. Okay. All right. And then Jamil?
Yeah, Jamil.
Quick question. You had mentioned about the reports that you guys put out, and I want to go read that. That sounds very interesting. Can you give us a tiny flavor of how you navigated that with legal? Because clearly, I would imagine.
That's such a good question.
Right. Because, I mean, there's liability. You report this or that.
Yeah.
I've never made any headway on that. I'd just love to know.
It's a fantastic question. And man, we should go out for a beer. It's a long story. Look, the super short version of the story is my CEO really, really wanted to do it. When he came in, we both started about the same time, and he's one of these guys, and he pushes this mantra: say, do. And up in front of Congress, we committed to being transparent and being a leader in the space. And he was really adamant that this was something that other organizations were not doing, but that we needed as a community. And so there was a lot of opposition as we went through that one, which is partially why we released it in year 3 of the transformation. But we got it over the hump. And I unquestionably could not have been able to do it myself. It took the CEO to push that narrative.
Yeah, I was wondering if any of you want to address or discuss non-publicly traded, non-regulated entities or industries and what should be done for incident reporting for them.
I think that the standards, the rules, everything are exactly the same in the sense that what would you want an entity to know about? So for example, GDPR, which I've spent a lot of time with, it's equally applicable to government agencies, to nonprofits, to corporations. And the fact is that you have to give them actionable intelligence, the authorities, within 72 hours of some kind of a compromise. And it's not just cyber, it's also including privacy. So you ask yourself, if I were in their shoes, what would I want to know? How can I help mitigate the damage that's going on right now? How can I prevent things from getting worse? What would I want to know as a consumer whose data has been compromised? What could I do to protect myself? So it's, I think, incumbent upon us all to think about what are the kind of things we would want to know if we were the victims, and then work backwards and package that up for the regulatory authorities.
I think if you're a SaaS platform or another company that is a vendor to many companies, certainly thinking about trust and transparency pages as part of the way that you differentiate competitively from a privacy and a security standpoint is a great way to think about that, even if you're not regulated or aren't subject to these other rules. And there used to be a time where that was a huge, outlier, but I think that's just becoming more and more the standard for a lot of companies that may not be regulated, but want to instill some confidence in their customers and in the market that they participate in. Other questions? Final comments? Scott, anything
I'm going to be
the audience should think about?
Well, I'm going to be a little bit provincial here, if I may. I think the relationship between the GC and the CISO is among the most important. And I say that as someone who, in a previous job, spent about an hour a day in the CISO's office. And that's so because everything we've talked about in the past hour has legal implications. And the sooner that you bring your GC into the process, the better that he or she can offer good advice, because that's really what we do. We offer advice. And to be able to do that, and then also when something bad does happen, or suspected something bad does happen, then the question is getting attorney-client privilege, getting that letter issued, getting all the investigation under attorney-client privilege so that you have the freedom to go and take the evidence to wherever it's going to go. And then down the road, the general counsel, in consultation with the board, can determine what actually gets released. But ultimately, having the GC and the CISO work together closely, there's no better relationship. And again, this is based on my own experience.
Leslie, final thoughts?
I think I'll piggyback on yours a little bit and just emphasize the fact that, at least when we think of cyber, we see it as it's enterprise-wide risk, right? It's everybody, leadership, the board is accountable. It's not only the CISO's purview. And just bearing that in mind, how important it is to have proper education to understand what your systems and mitigating factors you have access to are. So I think this is a mind shift, right? It's really the whole enterprise, and leadership has a huge role to play.
Jamil, final thoughts?
Buckle up. I would say buckle up. I think the regulators are upset. I think that they have seen, where this is going, and that they've encouraged organizations to do the right thing and do X, Y, and Z. And the results are your results, and our results have not been super fantastic so far if you look at all of the incidents out there. And I think that now that the scrutiny and the accountability, as you described, is being ratcheted up to the executive and board level, I think that anyone who's in security nowadays, my gosh, do we have job security? So it's good in that respect, but it also puts pressure on us. Like we've got to be able to adapt. Most of us came through the ranks in this technical track, and we know the bits and bytes, and we know the latest technologies and stuff like that. This is a different game. Like sitting I just joined my first commercial board, last quarter. It's a different game, and I think we all need to step up so that when we have our moment in the spotlight, which is now, and it's going to maintain for a little while. We've got to do our best, and we've got to step up to deliver on that promise and show that we're not just these boiler room folks who know all the technical stuff. But we are actually business leaders, and we can make meaningful risk decisions, and we can be thoughtful, and we can communicate at that level. So I'm actually super excited about it. I think that these changes are going to be good for the industry, good for our country, good for our economy, good for national security. But I think it's also going to be really good for us. And I'm looking forward to seeing how it all plays out.
Thank you. Well said. Thanks very much, Jamil, Leslie, Scott, for your time today. Thanks, everyone, for coming. And thanks very much for the questions. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well
I
done.
appreciate it. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.